So, hello everybody. We're talking to Jeanine Cummins today about American Dirt, her very famous book, and a very famous story in this book. She's going to tell us more about it. I'm saying hello to Jeanine, joining us from New York. Hi, Jeanine. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to speak with you.
Oh, likewise. Thank you. So, your book was a hit. It still is. And it raised quite a controversy from out of many reasons, actually. So literary and socially and so on. I know you're fed up with this kind of.
No, it's fine. It's actually I think it's quite fascinating, and it's quite interesting actually to talk to people from different parts of the world about how the controversy did or did not translate to other places. So I'm happy to discuss it.
Yeah. So I was talking to Colin McCann a couple of weeks ago about his experience of writing about things that he didn't know beforehand, or a culture that he wasn't involved in. And I know that this is at the core of the debate about your book, about your idea of writing about something you weren't very familiar with, but maybe you were. And after going through your book, I had the feeling that you were quite connected to the world you were writing about, although you didn't live, obviously, the experiences in the book. What were the main reasons that have made you choose such a topic and be interested in it? Because it's quite difficult it's quite a book. It's heavy, it's big, and it deals with very, very serious things, as I was saying.
Yeah. Well, the book took me 5 years to write. I started writing this book in 2013, and I don't know how it is in Romania, but here in the United States, the world is almost unrecognizable from where we were in 2013, midway through a Barack Obama presidency. Everything looks and feels different in our culture now than it did at that moment. And, I began, I think, being interested in the subject precisely because I felt like it was a topic that no one in this country was paying sufficient attention to at that time. I felt like where we were conducting our national discourse around this topic, we were doing it in a very unsatisfactory and very superficial way. And I happen to be a person who believes in the power of fiction to be a great empathy builder and to draw people into a story in a more intimate way than they may otherwise be prepared to engage with it. And I felt like there was room on the bookshelf for a story like this that would transport the reader directly into the skin and into the experiences of a person who has no choice but to leave her home. I felt like we were just doing a bad job paying attention, doing a bad job having this conversation in a way that felt meaningful and significant. And I always feel like novels are a great way to deepen the conversation, to open the conversation into something important. So, that's the way that I have used fiction throughout my own life is, from the time I was a child and I read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I had such a feeling of being transported into the experiences of someone who I needed to understand in a better way. And that's always the kind of writer that I have endeavored to be, is someone who takes a familiar story and turns it at a new angle. I'm deeply interested in taking the story away from the people who are typically at the center of the story. So in this case, if you turn on Netflix, you're going to find 2 or 3 dozen different iterations of stories about violence in Mexico. And every one of those stories has at its center a man with a gun. Whether he's a narcotraficante or a law enforcement officer is almost irrelevant. It's all about the violence of the guys who shoot each other. And it is almost never about the people who suffer at the other end of that violence. And so I wanted to put those people at the center of the story. So I began by doing a tremendous amount of research. I spent 5 years. I read everything I could find by contemporary Central American and Mexican writers, both fiction and nonfiction. And then I went to Mexico and I visited migrant shelters. I visited orphanages. I volunteered at a desayunador, which is like a soup kitchen for migrants. Mm-hmm. I spoke to everyone I could find who knew a lot more about the subject than I did. I talked to scholars, lawyers who are doing the pro bono legal work of representing unaccompanied kids. I talked to humanitarian aid workers, the people running the shelters, the people who are driving out into the desert and leaving water on known migrant trails in hopes that no one will die in those places anymore. And I talked to a lot of migrants directly. And throughout that process, you know, I felt a tremendous amount of resistance in myself about this journey that I was embarking on and whether or not I had the chops to write a story like this, whether I could do it justice. And to be frank, I was afraid of writing this book. And so the first 2 drafts that I wrote went into the garbage, completely into the garbage. Mm-hmm. And I stayed resistant for a long time. And then I would go to Mexico and I would meet these heroic nuns who were running the shelters. And every time I met someone new who had sort of dedicated their lives to helping vulnerable people in this journey, I felt sort of confronted by my own cowardice. I felt how absurd it was to be afraid of writing a novel, mm-hmm. when in fact I live a safe life. And so late in 2016, just before the presidential election, a week before the presidential election, I had an experience that changed everything about the way that I was writing this book. And frankly, that changed everything about my life. And that was that my mom and dad went out to dinner a week before the election, and they were out with some friends at a restaurant, and my dad died at the table in the restaurant. And my mom's a nurse. She did CPR until the paramedics arrived, and he was gone. They never got him back. He had a heart attack. And I was 3.5 years into the writing of this book at that time. And I was aware that it wasn't working. I was aware that it felt like garbage to me at that time. And I felt incredibly frustrated with it. And after my dad died, I felt like I just wasted 3.5 years of my life. And I was angry at myself. I was angry at the book. I was angry at everything. And I just put it away for a few months. And then, you know, after the sort of, and you know, there was something about the timing as well. The fact that a week later, my country elected Donald Trump as our president. Mm-hmm. I had a very strong feeling that all of the sort of paternal goodness had gone out of the world at once. Mm-hmm. That, you know, all the decency was gone. And I felt like it was a really, really dark moment in the world and in my life. And so I checked out of my life for a few months. And then one day, after the sort of darkest period had passed, I dragged my laptop into bed with me and I wrote the opening scene of American Dirt. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know at the time that I was starting over. I didn't know that I was going to throw away the draft that I had almost finished. But I think I knew as soon as those 7 pages were down in front of me that this was the book I had been resisting for 3.5 years, that it was the book my dad would be proud of, and that it was the book, for better or for worse, that I was intended to write. So I rented a casita in the desert. a few weeks later, I went there alone for 8 days and I wrote almost half the book in 8 days.
Wow. That's
you know, I had been steeping in this research for 3.5 years. And then, you know, it really came thundering out of me. Like once the resistance fell away, once I had the experience of letting go of my fear, the book was there. It just was there waiting for me to write it. And I think now, for better and for worse, you know, that's how it happened. And I've told that story so many times, and it's still like, I keep waiting for the day I can tell it and it like comes out of me painlessly. And I'm not there yet, but I'm always willing to go to that place and be vulnerable and share that story with people, because it's so important for me to help people understand that this book did not come from a place of entitlement in me. You know, it came from grief and love. And, you know, the grief that is in this book is my own grief. It was grief in real time that I was writing. Yeah.
I totally get you, because my father has died recently as well. So, well, I'm sorry for your loss too. Sorry.
It's the shittiest club in the world.
That's true. That's true. Actually, I was just thinking about this, that we live sheltered lives and we live in our own bubbles, and it's quite rare for us to come out of them. Something has to happen and something has to give out of that. And maybe that was your trigger as well. But you had written 2 drafts already, and you had done your work and your research. And for those who don't know the plot, it's the story of Lydia, a Mexican woman who is traveling to the US. Traveling is a euphemism. And she's taking La Bestia, the train, the death train, with her son. And she's running away because otherwise they would be killed by a cartel, which is run by Javier, a very charismatic character, but who is in the end a villain, the villain of the book. What was the reaction of the people who read the book and who had gone through similar experiences? You said that you talked to a lot of immigrants and to a lot of people who are living quite a hard life there, or maybe in the US as well. What did they say? You were talking about this sense of entitlement. Maybe you felt that people reckoned you wrote this book out of that, but that's not true. And I'm quite moved by what you said, and but by your reasons and the reasons you stated in the afterword as well in the book. How did you? What did you say to them? What was your reaction? And not that. Most probably you didn't have a face-to-face conversation with everybody who would have said something about the book in that way. But it's quite difficult to carry such a reaction, because you would like to be judged or appreciated for the writing, for the book. Because as you were saying, fiction is fiction. And you write because stories have a power to heal, a power to show, a power to build, and a power to reveal secrets or the truth about such experiences. So what was the reaction of the people you encountered, and what was the feedback you had?
Yeah, it's so difficult to put this in a concise response, because the reaction was so varied. And this was one thing that was very difficult for me to understand. It took me a long time to understand that the media response was not an accurate representation of the actual response of readers. It was a very limited and focused on sort of one reaction that they then, I would say, exaggerated as if that was the reaction. And it was especially problematic, I think, because very often in the media, the pretense was that the hatred that my book encountered was the Latino response, which was not true. You know, certainly some Latino people hated the book, and plenty of other people also hated the book, but they were in a very small minority. And in my experience, in fact, the people that I spoke with who were actual migrants, you know, loved the book and felt that it was very familiar to them and that it resonated with them, and that they saw moments that they recognized from their own experiences. Of course, it's a fiction and it doesn't represent everyone's experience. It doesn't even represent any one person's experience. It's an imaginary tale that I wrote on the foundation of a tremendous amount of research. But in the end, I used my imagination to create this story. And, you know, I think the idea that there was one reaction that sort of encompassed what everyone felt about this book was not true and not fair any more than it would be for any other novel. You know, I had some of the preeminent Latino writers of our time saying rapturously lovely things about the book. And then other people saying really awful things about the book and about me as a person. So the reaction was just tremendously varied. It was broad. There was as much, I should say there was a lot more, if I'm being honest, praise for the book than there was hatred.
What do you think was...
It's a long time to recognize that, because that was not the story that I saw reflected in the media.
What do you think was at the core of that hatred? The idea that one cannot write about things which don't belong to him directly. Like, for instance, any writer could assume how it would have been to be Napoleon. For instance, I could write about him, and I am a woman living in this century. I am taller than him, I think. And I'm just to joke about this. And I have no idea about how to conquer the world, nor the will to do so. And still, I could write about him, and I'm not talking about a biography. I'm talking about just writing about how to feel or how to be Napoleon in a story. So anyone can write about anything. Isn't this actually the real sense of entitlement, of pigeonholing areas of writing? Like, if you are from New York and you are white and you are a woman, you should be writing about these things and only these things. And the other things are restricted to you because you haven't felt them firsthand. You haven't lived them, but you've done your research. You could write about anything. You could go to China and write about how to be a Chinese peasant. And from this century or from another century, and or how people would have gone through the Cultural Revolution in the 60s or 70s. And if you do your research, don't you think it's enough? Like, if you write properly, of course, the writing itself is judged by other stick yards. So it's like, it's not the writing. This is what bothers me, for instance, in such matters, that it's not the writing which is in focus anymore, but what's behind it. And who's behind it, you know. And I will say, in my case, I think it's such a complicated issue, especially here in the United States. There are so many layers to it. And I think the easiest one to pick off the top is the fact that the conditions were exactly right for something like this to happen. I think Latino writers, and specifically Mexican writers, have been undervalued and underpaid and overlooked for a very long time. And there was a tremendous backlog of anger. And, you know, this sort of simmering
acknowledgement that Latino writers were not getting their fair share. And then I should just say, the whole controversy was predicated on the back of one very angry review that was written in bad faith and that had a tremendous amount of false information about me and about who I am. And also a lot of distorted information. And I think that it was crafted in such a way as to give people an idea about me that was entirely wrong. And so they saw this idea of who they thought I was before they even read the book. And they were outraged that this person, this incredibly privileged white non-Latino person, had stolen the story from the people who had actually lived it and experienced it, and that I was profiting from that trauma. I think that caused a tremendous amount of outrage, and I can understand that. I will say that I do not recognize that person, the person that I was created to be in the media. I am Latina, and it doesn't matter because I can be anyone and I can write any story that I want to. But the notion that my ethnicity was up for adjudication on Twitter was very, very painful. And I'm going to try not to curse here. It was like really messed up that, that suddenly people who don't know me, who've never met me, who know nothing about me, got to determine whether or not I was an actual Latina. No one's business but mine. I happen to be Puerto Rican. Yeah. I have always been Puerto Rican. I was born that way. And it doesn't matter. It's nobody's business, but my family, my DNA. And I was shocked that this was a thing that became so central to the argument against me, that I had somehow falsified my ethnicity. And that, again, it was established in bad faith, because I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in 2015 where I identified myself as white because I am white, race and ethnicity are separate. This is a thing that lots of white people don't understand in this country. They think that if you are Latino, that means this is your race. Being Latino is not a race, it's an ethnicity. I am Latino, I'm Latina, and I am white. I am both of those things. I always have been. And I identified myself as white in that 2015 essay in the New York Times because I felt like it was really important to acknowledge the privilege conferred by my whiteness. That was in no way to close the door on all the other elements of my identity, which are equally valid, and it was very painful to have to go through all of that in such a public way, where my strangers on Twitter were deciding for me what parts of my identity were valid, and no writer should have to go through that. It has nothing to do with the book that I wrote, in fact, But I should say, I do think that being a person who's part Puerto Rican, along with being all the other parts of my identity that make me who I am, being Catholic, being a mother, being, being a person raised on the East Coast, being someone who's progressive, being, all these different things, being a person who has suffered actually real trauma in my life, like a lot of trauma. All of those things informed the book that I wrote and the way that I wrote this book and my capacity to write this book. And, of course, and that's true for every writer, your own life experiences and your identity, those things make you who you are. And of course, they're going to have a bearing on the way that you tell and create a story. But it shouldn't be anyone else's business unless I determine to share it in a really intimate way, you know, what my own life experiences are that actually made an impact on the creation of this novel.
Yeah, or you could have written it under a pen name and then your identity would have been unknown. So I was just thinking while you were talking about what Orwell said, that any art is political. So writing fiction has become very, very political lately. Whatever you write, it represents you in a way which becomes political afterwards.
Yes.
Who did you write this book for? Was it for yourself? Was it for a specific image of an audience interested in such topics? Was it for the progressive, as you said? Was it for the times, meaning that we are going through such convoluted times that this book was meant to be written because of this? I'm not asking if you had an ideal reader in mind. That's quite naive to ask. I think whenever I hear this question.
People have actually asked me that a lot. Ideal reader. And it's it's such a problematic question. I feel like it's a trap every time.
No, I'm not asking this because I find it quite naive. There's no ideal reader.
Yeah.
Any reader can be the ideal reader as long as the book is read.
Exactly. I think the only maybe satisfactory way I have to answer that question is to say, you know, when Oprah Winfrey called me and we had the conversation the very first day that I spoke with her, and she told me that she had selected the book for her book club, and it was such a thrilling moment in my life. You know, this is my fourth book, and my three previous books were all sort of modestly published. I had never been published outside of the United States before. I never, you know, I was a lower mid-list writer, and that's where I expected this book to land also. I never anticipated the kind of response that it would receive. And when I got that phone call from Oprah, it was like winning the lottery. It was like, you know, this heart-stopping moment. And during the course of that conversation, I remember, I think I blacked out during a lot of it, but I do remember a few moments. And I said to her at some point, you know, I hoped you would read it. And she said, me specifically, or just people? And I said, no, you specifically, Oprah Winfrey. and she said, why me? And I said, because you have the reach to get to those readers who otherwise would never, ever pick up a book about migrants. And, you know, who wouldn't care. And she said, well, we will now. And it was such I think that's what I hoped for, you know, in my heart of hearts. I hoped that people who were not engaging with this story would engage with this story. I hope that people who were not paying attention would begin to pay attention.
Yeah, that's you impersonated her in a funny way. So I could see Oprah promising you the reach that actually she fulfilled. She kept her word, and your book was quite successful after that. Of course, the controversy went on, but that might also help. So following the principle that it's better to be read than ignored, even if the reaction to the book is not the best. But I think that it's also easy to say something bad about something you haven't read or seen or gone through yourself, which happens to a lot of things, artistic or literary. What happens to the movie rights? So Are you involved in that? Is there a TV series or a movie to be made after it?
Well, we sold the movie rights way before the book came out, and then the company who bought them re-optioned them, I think last January. I'm not sure when they will expire, but I haven't spoken to the producer, I think, in like a year. So I don't really know what's going on with it, or if they are still intending to make it or not. And I have to say, it's always exciting, the idea of a movie for a writer. But in this case, for me, I feel like I would love to see this movie made, but it would be so easy to get it wrong. And it would be so fraught, as a project. I only hope that if the movie does come to pass, that, I think we need a Mexican screenwriter. I think we need a Mexican director. I think I would want Central American actresses in those roles for Rebecca and Soledad. There are lots of things that I think would be sort of fundamentally important to making the movie correctly. And at the end of the day, I have no control. So.
But why would you want a Mexican director? Because we're coming back to the core topic. So why not a New Yorker? Why not an Eastern European directing a movie? So.
I know. I just think, given what happened with American Dirt, the novel, I think in order to sort of course correct some of the presumptive problems about representation in the industry, specifically for this movie, I would want it to be a Mexican director. Which is not to say that for other novels that I have written or will write, that I would require that same kind of ironclad representation. But for this novel specifically, because it has already provoked such a controversy, such a polemic, I would not want the movie to fall into the same, I would not want the movie to have to deal with the same issues. I don't know. I'm open.
Do you speak Spanish?
Yes. Nací en España. Spanish was my first language. I was born in Spain. But I've gotten very bad at Spanish. So I was fluent when I was a kid. I'm no longer fluent, but I tried.
Well, yeah, you can teach your children Spanish and then get it back. So
yes. Exactly.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about the title, because in Romanian it was translated as American land or American soil.
Okay.
Which kind of loses the meaning in English, American dirt. Of course, when you say American dirt, for me, for instance, it's easy to make a connection with white trash or something like that. So was that what you had in mind? Of course, the metaphor could have been that American dirt is what comes as a dust from the outside. But
so there were a lot of different, one thing that I really liked about the title was the ambiguity of it. The fact that you could attach so many different meanings to it, among which were, how we treat migrants in this country. We treat them like dirt. And, but I think sort of before that, for me, the first way I came to the title, I don't know if in the Romanian edition there are the maps on the inside cover.
Yes. Yeah.
So we had those maps commissioned, especially because I wanted them to be borderless.
Sure.
I wanted them to demonstrate that the land mass is all one. It's all one piece of land. And I am cognizant, have always been cognizant, that the word American elsewhere in the Americas, this word there's some deal of exasperation among the Canadians and other, other Americans and Caribbean Americans about the way that word has been sort of hijacked culturally to mean United Statesian. And we actually don't even have a word in English that means estadounidense. We just use American as if that's what it means. And, I was acutely aware of that. And because of that, I don't use the word American anywhere in the novel at all, except where I'm referring to Central Americans or the American flag. There is only one line in the book where that word exists. And it's when Rebecca arrives at the border and she spits through the bars to leave a piece of herself on American dirt. And I used it in that moment because it felt there like it was a nod to all the territorial ways we've come to use that word, and that it might actually express the sort of absurdity of the idea that the dirt on one side of the border is any different from the dirt on the other side of the border, when it's clear that it's all the same dirt. In my mind, the whole book takes place in American dirt, on American dirt, because Mexico is part of the Americas. Central America is part of the Americas. All of these characters are American characters.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And you realize the whole complexity of it after you've gone through the whole book. Well, one of the most spectacular parts of the book is definitely the train ride. How did you do the research for that? La Bestia is quite a legend. The death train bringing the migrants to the US. It's also an industry. Yes.
So there's a tremendous amount of research you can do from the comfort of your own home about La Bestia. So, there's a wonderful book by a Central American writer named Oscar Martinez called La Bestia. In Spanish, I think it's called The Beast. It's just called The Beast in English. And he is a reporter who actually rode the train all the way from Central America to the border of the United States. And his reporting is just harrowing on this score. There are also there's another book called Enrique's Journey, which talks at length about La Bestia. There are a number of documentaries, and actually there's a feature film as well, a fictional feature film about La Bestia. And there are a gazillion YouTube videos that you can watch. So I did not ride La Bestia because it's incredibly dangerous. But I did all of that sort of academic research, and then I met a lot of people who had made the journey that way. In fact, when I was at a migrant shelter in Tijuana, I met a young man from Honduras who was 22 years old, and he came into the shelter the day that I was there, and he had lost his leg on the train 3 days before. So he was very much still getting accustomed to his new
reality.
Yeah. And watching him grapple with his new position was just tremendously moving. And, it was one of the experiences that I had in the course of my research that really drove home for me the difference between understanding something with your brain and understanding it with your heart.
And what had happened? Sorry, I'm interrupting you, not because I want to know gory details, but because it's important to know what are the real dangers of riding this train. So not only the social or political dangers of being rejected or being found out or being extradited or something like that, but how did he lose his leg?
Every single day, migrants are falling off of that train and losing a leg or both legs, or very often dying. There are people being maimed and killed on that train every day. So the danger is very real. And on top of that, there is also the very strong likelihood that you will encounter violent crime on the train, because the trains, like all criminal enterprise in Mexico, are controlled by the carteleros. So, you are likely to be, if you are a person who's vulnerable and you're riding that train, you are at the very least likely to be robbed, and not unlikely also to encounter the threat of kidnapping, extortion, rape, if you're a woman, any number of horrors. It's an incredibly dangerous journey.
Yeah. So I was just, I had the image of Trump's wall while you were talking, and the train hitting it full speed. So it's, these things exist, and it's quite rare to understand that fiction has the power, but at the same time doesn't have the power to change reality. It changes reality for us living in our bubbles.
Yeah.
But if you take the truth as it is in reality and put it into fiction, it doesn't work. You have to change something in it, because otherwise it's just, you stretch it too much. And it's very difficult to find the right balance when you write about such things, which really exist and which are at the border of the documentary fiction.
Yes, yes.
What was the scene which was the most difficult to write? The emotional toll, which was the biggest in the book?
I mean, there were plenty of scenes. I will say one funny thing, not funny, it's not funny at all, but like one peculiar thing is that I did not realize until the book was finished that every single character is grieving for her father. Every one of them, Lydia even, and Javier.
And Luca. Yeah.
It's so obvious. It's one of those things, like in hindsight, I'm like, well, okay, clear to see where I was coming from. So those scenes, the scene when Rebecca receives that phone call, that was tough. All the grief scenes were hard, but I should say there were two that were much harder than the others. And they were both scenes that I added in revision. They were not scenes that existed in the book when I first turned it in. One was, without giving too much away, the scene with Beto at the very end. That was really hard to write. There was a lot of weeping involved when I wrote that. And then also at the very end, there is a scene during the crossing where there are two adult brothers and their two sons, and two of them, can't make it, and they need to go find a road, try to get to safety. They need to go try to basically turn themselves into the mercy of the Border Patrol. And that was, I should say, I think that was the hardest scene to write, even though it didn't involve any of the principal characters in the book, because the research that I had to do while I was writing that scene, I had to learn about the biology of what happens to a person when you succumb to exposure in the desert. And I understood as I was writing that scene, like, that a migrant is dying this way every 15 hours. A human being is at the Mexico-US border dying of dehydration or of hypothermia or exposure. And I had to learn about, what happens to the biological systems of the human body when you die in that way. And thinking about how many people have died in that way, and the tremendous suffering that is involved. It was just like I could have happily lived the rest of my life without learning about that.
Yeah. Well, so when you write about such matters, you learn a lot, and something changes in you too. So, and hopefully something changes in the readers as well. What would be the message that you would like to send out with the book, or something that the readers should retain as an idea?
Yeah.
Beyond the story, which is beautiful.
Well, I think that's the one, I think you just said it, beyond the story. That this is what my greatest hope is, that if people read the story and they feel some empathy, if they feel some compassion for these characters, that they can transfer that compassion beyond the story and onto the real migrants who need compassion and empathy. You know, we are living in this time when, unfortunately, compulsory migration, not only in the Americas, but all over the world, is really like the story of our times. You know, so many people have to leave their home place, not because they want to, but because they genuinely cannot stay where they are for a variety of reasons. And I would hope that people who read American Dirt and feel empathy for Luca can also feel empathy for people who are migrating in the world right now, for reasons beyond their control.
Well, that's a great message and a great ending for our conversation. Thank you so much. It's been very inspiring and very deep.
Thank you.
And we look forward to meeting you here in Bucharest and to reading your next novels.
Thank you.